Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I wanted to welcome you to another Village Torah discussion. This week we have a double Torah portion. It is Vayakhel-Pekudei. These are actually the last two Torah portions in the book of Exodus. Now, what's really fascinating what happens in Pekudei and also at the end of Vayakhel. So really for the majority of our Torah portion this week, we really get a lot of verses, a lot of words that we've actually already have read earlier in the book of Exodus. Now, what am I talking about? I am talking about the construction of the Mishkan, of the Israelites contributing their material, their gold, their silver, all sorts of material goods, contributing it towards the construction of the Mishkan. Now, the Mishkan, as some of you may remember from previous weeks, I enjoy translating as God's apartment, because the root is shachan, it's dwelling. So this is God's dwelling amidst the Jewish people, amidst the Israelites, and this residence, as it were, is the focal point of where the sacrifices are to be taking place. Now, what we have earlier in the book of Exodus is God instructing the Jewish people, the Israelites, what is to be done, what is to be donated, how it is to be all put together. That happens earlier. Now what we see is the actual construction of the Mishkan, of God's apartment, as it were. I say God's apartment. It's commonly translated as either tabernacle or sanctuary. Both very nice. Well, for now, we'll just call it the Mishkan, God's apartment. So with this Mishkan, we have finally, it's nice to read about what we should do, what we're commanded, what we're instructed to do, but now we see the culmination. Now we see it actually taking place. We see it actually being built. Now, what's really fascinating, perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects that appears and occurs, is not simply that people build it, but it actually, some of it requires fine, not just handiwork, but craftsmanship. And so there we have Bezalel, who is this figure who is tasked with leading the, almost I want to call it an artistic charge, as it were. This is a really fascinating artistic, I don't know, it's a really interesting artistic endeavor, undertaking. This huge construction. There's a lot involved. Now, I want to connect a little bit. We really could talk about the Mishkan and all the building, but what's fascinating is at the outset of this week's Torah portion has seemingly nothing to do with this week with the Mishkan. Okay, so we have in Exodus chapter 35 verses 2 and 3. In 6 days work shall be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a Sabbath of complete rest. Shabbat Shabbaton Ladonai. A Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Oh, it's an interesting translation. I would translate it as, it shall be for you holy, a Sabbath of resting for the Lord. Anybody who does work on it or labor shall die. And verse 3, you shall kindle no fire in all of or any of your residences or settlements on the Sabbath day, on the day of rest. So, okay, very interesting. We get a nice piece here about Shabbat, about resting. There's not really much, to be honest, there's really not much of why. We have other articulations, even elsewhere and earlier in the book of Exodus, articulations as to why we should be observing Shabbat, why we should be guarding it. Here, really, there's nothing about that. It's just simply, if you violate it, there's negative consequences. Although, curiously, we do also get this prohibition against kindling fire on Shabbat. Really interesting, because one of the deepest fascinations that we see in the Torah is that there really is not a whole lot articulating the boundaries of observing Shabbat. What is Shabbat? What should one do? What should one not do? We see in the Torah that it talks about not that there were some men who gathered sticks, and that was problematic. We have here not kindling fire anywhere on Shabbat. Interesting that we have these But there's but then what we then move into the Mishkan. Now, the rabbis were very curious about this very fascinating, very stark, very evident juxtaposition, this connecting. And we have this really interesting insight here from Rashi, who is an early medieval commentator, perhaps the most famous, perhaps the most classic of rabbinic medieval commentators. And he says, on 6 days. So he says, Hiktim lahem azharat Shabbat. He intentionally mentioned to them the prohibition in reference to the Shabbat before the command about the building of the tabernacle, or as I like to translate it, God's apartment, in order to intimate it that it does not set aside the Sabbath or Shabbat. Now, that this is a really interesting thing. What the rabbis do about this juxtaposition between Shabbat and the building of the Mishkan is that they say, look, there's further lessons to be drawn out. That it's not that they're two totally disparate things that have nothing to do with each other. There's something to be learned from their being put together. One thing of which is not just what we read early in the 35th chapter of Exodus about not lighting fires, but also the various labors mentioned in the construction of the Mishkan, that those two are things that are to be refrained from on the Sabbath day. That I think the rabbis perceive it almost as if, just as God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day, that the construction of the Mishkan was to some degree almost like our own world building of sorts. That it was this very constructive endeavor, just as God, when he constructed the world, when he built the world, when he made the world and fashioned it, so too the fashioning of the Mishkan, the construction of God's residence here, is like a mini world building, right? We've been instructed, just as God built the world or created, fashioned the world in a certain way within 6 days, so too we are constructing from God's blueprints. We are constructing almost like a mini world of sorts. And therefore, the significant importance of resting on the seventh day. And that the labors there are, just as we commemorate God's not just creation of the world in 6 days, but more importantly, resting on that seventh day when having created the world, so too we are fashioning the tabernacle and mandated to rest on that seventh day. And so I don't know if you may be familiar, some of you may have heard this, but what the rabbis do, the early rabbis, they say, look, there are 39 various labors that are involved with the construction of the Mishkan, and those 39 labors are forbidden on Shabbat. And the rabbis, in their way, of course, come up and develop various other things associated with those labors. So I want to say toldot, various, I want to say offspring, but little things that come off from it. Now, what happens is, I want to point something else out. I just find this so deeply fascinating. So we could talk about how these things were forbidden and all this and that, but one of the things that I am so super duper fascinated by is the very beginning. It's not just simply the Sabbath aspect of the resting on the Sabbath to imitate God. I think there's a lot of focus on this seventh day, this resting day. But I think there's something very important to point out about the beginning. Sheshes yamim teaseh malacha. 6 days you shall do work. You shall be endeavoring in the construction and putting our energies towards the building of the world, towards productive and towards constructive activities that we are to some degree really supposed to be involved in the world, that we're supposed to be doing things. And that seventh day forces us to focus on not just constantly doing, but reflecting and relaxing, which I don't think it gets enough attention, but there is a certain significance and importance, I would say, to what we can do in the 6 days. And it's really even more fascinating nowadays that we have various avenues to be involved with the world and to help construct it. So I've heard people joking that that this is almost the commandment to do stuff for 6 days, that for people who might not really want to do anything, that I don't know, it's an interesting piece to consider. So I hope that was interesting and insightful. Yes, we have the final, not just the instructions to construct the Mishkan, but the actual construction of the Mishkan. And there's this really fascinating juxtaposition from the very outset of this week's Torah portion, talking about Shabbat, and then juxtaposing that, connecting it then with the Mishkan, the construction of the Mishkan, the building of the tabernacle, the sanctuary, and how that might actually, according to the rabbis, actually play with each other. They might interact in a really fascinating way. And we have also, you know what, I'm gonna share something else. I'm gonna throw in one other thing, which it's one thing to talk about doing something. It really is. And that's what we see earlier on in the book of Exodus. God commanding Moses to instruct the Jewish people, you have to build this, which is great. You have to take donations. You have to put it all together. You have to actually build it. Talking about ideas, talking about plans is wonderful. It's lovely, but sometimes people don't follow through. I think everybody here has lived long enough to know that people talk, but don't necessarily do. And so that's a really fascinating importance of, I think this week's Torah portion shows and demonstrates the significance and importance of carrying out what one plans to do. So I hope, I want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. And, it's Shabbat. It's a day of rest. I hope we had 6 days of productivity, 6 days of doing things, and now we get to relax and reflect. So with that, I want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom.